the Assistant Treasurer and Minister for Housing, Michael Sukkar, joining us from Melbourne this morning. Thanks very much for your time. Look, can I just start by picking up on a couple of things in the papers there this morning, the Medevac laws. So this story that only 2 have actually been approved by the medical panel against the minister's wishes. Would you say that the so-called activist doctors are really letting through a flood of arrivals, as was feared?
Well, good to be with you, David. I mean, the responsible minister's made clear his views on this issue, and I would just point to a recent court decision which essentially said that 2 doctors who have never met the patient, essentially just by presumably reviewing files, are able to make application for those particular individuals to be brought to Australia. I think that is patently ridiculous that 2 doctors who have never met or examined the patient are able to do that. So, and I think that's a very good example of why these laws, David, are completely unworkable, impractical, and I don't think ultimately in our national interests. There are holes all throughout this legislation.
I was just going to say, even if the 2 doctors do recommend the transfer, you still have this panel of medical experts that make the ultimate decision here, and well, the figures in this story today suggest they're being pretty cautious. Only twice have they gone against the minister's wishes.
Well, the minister made clear that there had been 30 of these transfers, and I noted the story that you've referred to this morning. I use the example, though, David, of that particular court decision because it is the most obvious example that one can point to for the complete unworkability and the holes in these laws, and these laws are riven with these sorts of issues. So from our perspective, David, we want to ensure the integrity of our borders. Obviously, we oppose these Medevac laws, and I think bit by bit we just see more and more holes in what was ultimately put forward, and that's why we are seeking to do what we are.
OK, but before we leave this issue, are you of the view that the integrity of our borders has been compromised by these laws? I'm of the view that these laws do not enhance the work that we have done, the very painstaking work, David, that we have done over many years to restore integrity to our borders. And if they don't assist that process, and the minister and the government has made our views on it very clear, and you have examples like the one I just pointed out that highlight the patent ridiculous nature of some of these laws, I think it strengthens our argument for why they should be repealed. OK, but have our borders been compromised, though, if only 2 have been brought in against the minister's wishes?
Well, they don't enhance it, David, quite clearly. I think it's self-evident in my statement there that they certainly don't enhance the painstaking work we have done, and if they don't enhance what we have done to restore integrity to our borders, that of itself is an issue.
Let's turn to the tax cut debate. One of Labor's concerns about the tax cuts you took to the election is that 3rd stage doesn't take effect for another 5 years, 2024. Why do you need to legislate now when you don't know what the economy is going to be like then?
Well, David, look, these discussions were very, very widely canvassed throughout the election. On one hand, you had the Labor Party running their faux class war agenda for higher taxes, hitting investors, retirees, workers. On the other hand, at the election, you had us speaking every day about our plan for reducing income taxes, for relieving, particularly for low and middle income earners. And I suppose the point I'd make in all these sorts of discussions, David, is that a plan like this all hangs together. And the Labor Party wants to cherry pick one or the other parts of the plan, which they did before the election. They have been rebuffed by the Australian people. Our plan, which was well spoken about, it all hangs together. It provides income tax relief for lower middle income earners, prioritising those in the short term, but then making very important structural changes to our economy and to our tax system to make sure we remain competitive, to make sure that essentially Australians are encouraged to continue doing what they are doing, which is working very hard, and those middle income Australians who bear such a big proportion of our tax system deserve this relief. And David, you know, Labor's arguments around trying to cherry pick one part or the other, buying themselves time. Anthony Albanese admitted on television the other night that they were running a phony class warfare campaign. Well, now he's got to put his money where his mouth is and lead his very, very divided party on this issue to support the government's tax cuts.
Do you accept, though, it's unusual to legislate tax cuts 5 years in the future?
I don't accept that at all, David. I mean, we have a tax plan, and not only in this
Has it ever happened before, though?
In the previous budget, where we stage the tax changes, we ensure that they flow in over 7 years. We think that's responsible. When you're making structural changes of this nature, it's sensible from a budgetary perspective to ensure you do it in an orderly fashion and in a way that the budget can manage. And as I said, the entire plan hangs together. You cannot cherry pick it. And the Labor Party, I suspect, are trying to buy themselves time because they are hopelessly divided on this issue. But nobody can argue, David, that this was not spoken about ad nauseum during the election campaign. And Labor's phony class war campaign has been rebuffed.
In the end, you may not need Labor. Centre Alliance say they're inclined to back it. They are concerned about energy prices, gas prices in particular on this. Now, I know there's no deals on the table here, but would you like to see more Australian gas kept in Australia for domestic use, as Centre Alliance is suggesting?
Well, David, look, I'll leave those sorts of decisions and comments up to the responsible minister. What I'd like to see, and I think what our government's worked very hard towards, is to ensure that to the greatest extent possible domestic gas prices are reduced. And there was some very significant changes that occurred between the government and industry 12 to 18 months ago, which brought down domestic gas prices.
This is the export trigger.
Correct, which brought down gas prices.
Is that doing the job, do you think?
Well, David, I think they've made some very, very important initial changes to ensure that the gas price was quite significantly reduced in a short period of time. I suppose no one can argue against lower gas prices, lower domestic gas prices. How you achieve that and the process by which it occurs, I will leave up to the responsible minister. But one
way, I suppose, would be to say new gas developments, New South Wales or the Northern Territory, more gas from any new development must be kept in Australia.
Well, look, gas reservation policies are not new, David. There is certainly at least one jurisdiction in this country that I'm aware of with a gas reservation policy. They're well understood. There are a whole host of issues with those, particularly if you are trying to apply them retrospectively. As far as the prospective nature that you've described, again, I would leave that up to the minister, but I'd say the government is absolutely determined to do what we can to reduce gas prices. So in that sense, our objectives and those of the Centre Alliance are the same. How we would go about achieving those and negotiating it, again, I will leave to those who are responsible for the policy.
Do you think the CFMMEU should be deregistered?
Well, look, David, there's no doubt the CFMMEU is, as some courts have described, really a rogue organisation, a militant organisation. Their form over many years, the many hundreds of court cases that have resulted in fines or penalties against CFMMEU officials, and of course John Setka, who, let's be honest, his behaviour over a very, very long period of time has been accepted by the Labor Party because presumably the Labor Party can't bite the hand that feeds them, given that the CFMMEU contributes so much money to the Labor Party. As far as their deregistration, I think there's some very good case, or a very good case that could be made for that. But I think at first instance, the Labor Party could assist the CFMMEU and other rogue organisations reform themselves and improve their performance and improve the way in which they operate within the law by actually putting some pressure on them and supporting a range of legislation we've put forward over many years. Because, David, I think the problem here is the Labor Party contort themselves and do everything they possibly can to give unions like the CFMMEU a free pass. They oppose every piece of legislation that we put forward to improve governance or integrity around unions like this. And now they're surprised to see the fruits of that opposition to those sorts of laws is somebody like John Setka and the CFMMEU, which I think even now the Labor Party is quite embarrassed about.
Just back to this question. I mean, the Minister for Industrial Relations, Christian Porter, says the appropriate sanction is to deregister the union. Do you agree with that?
Well, it's an appropriate sanction available. I suppose you could make a fair argument.
But in this example, I mean, I'm just getting back to this question: should this union be deregistered?
Yeah. Well, I'm answering it in this way, David. I think there's a very good argument to be made that says if you don't deregister an organisation like the current CFMMEU, then which organisation would ever qualify to be deregistered? So I can understand that argument. I think there are some very good reasons why that may occur, but again, I'd leave that up to Christian Porter. It's obviously something that's a sanction that is ultimately available, but it is really, I suppose, the last sanction, the most serious, that is available under the legislation.
And this is the bill that you want to bring back. The Ensuring Integrity Bill makes it easier to deregister a union. So that is something the government will pursue. And
it makes some other changes as well in relation to public interest tests for various restructures of unions. And again, I get back to the earlier point I made, David. On one hand, the Labor Party absolutely fights us tooth and nail on every piece of legislation, including that you referred to, that seeks to improve integrity within the union movement, and yet now act all surprised and feign indignation when somebody like John Setka, who has been allowed to conduct himself in the most inappropriate way for literally years, and I can only put that down to the fact, David, that the Labor Party find it very difficult to bite the hand that feeds them, being a union that contributes so much money. So I'd say to Anthony Albanese, put your money where your mouth is. Say today that the Labor Party will no longer accept money from the CFMMEU whilst John Setka is there. I think if he doesn't do that, anything else he says is quite hollow.
All right, let's turn to your portfolio as Housing Minister. You were in Tasmania this week where the state government there is asking you to waive their historic debt on public housing of $157 million. Will you do that?
Well, David, as I pointed out this week when I was in Tasmania, that is not a decision that can be taken, firstly, outside of a budget process, and secondly, it's not just as easy for me to walk into any state or territory and just write that off on behalf of Commonwealth taxpayers, partly because the consequences are much broader. There's a Commonwealth housing debt of nearly $2.2 billion. Every state and territory around the country other than Victoria who's repaid their housing debt. So it's something that I said I'd be happy to...
What about South Australia? Did South Australia have their debt waived?
Well, South Australia's got a debt of $189 million at the moment. There was a deal done, I understand, during the Gillard years that provided some relief for their debt. But again, as I've made clear in Tasmania, if we were, as a government, to forgive Tasmania's debt, it would be very logical that every other state and territory would ask for the same treatment, and that's obviously a $2.2 billion decision. Can I just make the point, though, that from Tasmania's perspective, not only do we invest $33 million under the National Housing and Homelessness Agreement, which under Scott Morrison as Treasurer, we indexed the funding, we made homelessness funding permanent.
They're saying they have to pay about $15 million back of that $33 million they get to service this debt.
But there's additional investments that I'm just about to refer to, David. I mean, this week I was touring a site that's going to have 55 new social and affordable housing units built on it, part with funding, part of which came from the Hobart City deal, which was $30 million for social and affordable housing. Plus, there's a range of programs for immediate relief, domestic violence relief.
So you'll help them out in other ways. You'll help them out in other ways, but maybe not wiping this debt.
Well, I suppose the implications, and this is the point I made clearly in Tasmania, the implications of waiving any state or territory's debt is very significant, and it is not a decision that could be taken lightly or certainly outside of the budget context. So when you've got an issue, as we do in Hobart and in other parts of Tasmania, what can we do to provide immediate relief now? And that's why I was very pleased to see that the $30 million of funding provided under the Hobart City deal for social and affordable housing, it's not dragging on. The site I was at, 55 new social and affordable homes, work will start in September, which means from the announcement to the time work starts, we're only talking about a matter of months, which means houses will be on the ground very quickly. And that is a much better outcome for Tasmanians than some theoretical discussion around Commonwealth and state relationships and the debt that was accrued over many decades from the 50s to the 80s.
Final question on Cory Bernardi. So he quit the Liberal Party after 2016 election, set up a rival political outfit which has failed. He's now deregistering it. Should he be welcomed back with open arms if he wants to come back to the Liberal Party?
Well, David, look, these sorts of decisions are ultimately matters for the party organisation, and in this case, the party organisation in South Australia. I've been very encouraged to see some of Cory's comments about the direction of our party, and I'm quite satisfied that he's accepted and conceded that those mainstream Conservative Australians have flocked back to the Liberal Party under the leadership of Prime Minister Morrison. I think these sorts of decisions can't be taken lightly, and I will leave those to the South Australian division and the leadership of our party. But we will be seeking to work very cooperatively and constructively with Cory in the Senate after he's deregistered his party, certainly.
Minister for Housing and Assistant Treasurer Michael Sukkar, thanks very much for joining us this morning. I appreciate that.
Thanks so much, David.